Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And my apologies, I can't be there in person. I really look forward to coming back to India. But these days it's a little bit difficult with three small children. Once they're a little bit bigger, I hope to be back in person. But thank you for letting me do this remotely. Today, what I want to talk about, now you've by this point heard a lot about technological leadership and India's role in that. I want to talk a little bit more about moral leadership. Uh, So I think actually in general, the world would benefit from more of India's moral leadership as well. And I think sometimes maybe India underestimates how important its moral leadership is to the world. That's more broad than I can talk about today. Today, I want to talk about moral leadership in AI. And this may sound a little bit unusual in the sense that AI is a technical topic. And so this doesn't sound maybe immediately like something that intersects with ethics. But in fact, it does. And that's what I'll try to explain today. And at the same time, there is a technical component to this, of course, as well. While some of this may come through government, there is, in fact, I think, a lot of room for startups in this space as well. Some of the major consultancies are getting involved. Um, and so I want to give a little bit of a sense of how that works. I also realize that for you, it's already late in the day. And so I want to keep it a little bit light. I'm going to talk mostly about large language models and similar systems because everybody enjoys those. And I think that will keep everybody awake. Um, but the points that I want to make today do go broader than just large language models. And if you want to know more about that, you can read our book. You see it here on the left. Here's a physical copy. Um, and this is really a very broad general audience book that we very recently wrote. It doesn't actually go into large language models all too much because it took a while to write the book. And meanwhile, the models have taken off recently. So in that sense, it will complement my talk well. Okay. So what should we want from AI in general, and in particular from large language models? So let's focus on large language models like ChatGPT. How should we want them to behave? And that's a very broad question. So to illustrate what I mean, I first want to start with something that is maybe not what I exactly want to talk about, but should be somewhat amusing at least. So when ChatGPT came out, I, like everybody else, was trying to figure out what kinds of things is it able to do and what kinds of things is it not able to do. So I'm going to show you here a conversation that's maybe a little bit small. I don't know if you can see it, but I was asking it if it can draw a map of the world in ASCII. In ASCII, drawing in ASCII meaning like drawing something with text characters, right? Maybe I'm dating myself, but some decades ago, people would have these email signatures. I don't know if you remember these, where they drew something in their email signatures with characters, would never show up right. Anyway, I was curious whether ChatGPT would be able to do this because it's not obvious that it should be able to do such a thing. And at the same time, we saw these abilities emerge from these systems that sometimes it was surprising what it could do. So I asked it, and it actually responded quite positively. It said, well, I can do that now, lowering expectations a little bit. It said, well, the proportions will be off a little bit. And I thought, this is great. I was not expecting this to work at all. Now, the next thing it did was in a sort of terminal window, it displayed to me, well, something. I will show you what it is. This is a PowerPoint animation, but I'm revealing it gradually so that you get the sense of how it felt to me. So here's how it started to appear. It started with something round, so that was good. And not quite the world, and no, it's actually not. It's a human skull. Uh, this was quite surprising to me, and it said, well, I hope this provides you with a bit of fun and amusement. Initially, I did not know what to make of this. Is it maybe a subtle death threat from the machines to humanity? Or does it have a kind of strange sense of humor? Is this picture ripped off, meaning is it stolen from somewhere or just directly copied? Or does it just not know what it's doing? I didn't know initially. I went and I posted this picture on social media, this whole interaction. I like posting these kinds of examples on social media. And remarkably, somebody actually found the exact source of this image. Okay. So while even at this point, usually ChatGPT was not directly plagiarizing anymore, it was plagiarizing this image. So somebody actually managed to find the source of this image. It's exactly the same, except the signature got removed And also, intriguingly, it came from a site called ASCII World. So that's presumably why it responded with this. Okay, I played around with it a little bit more, and it turns out it just did not know how to draw in ASCII at that point. This was GPT 3.5. And again, there's no good reason to think that it should have figured out how to draw in ASCII just from a lot of text. Remarkably, I tried it again with GPT-4, and with GPT-4, it actually can kind of do it sometimes. All right, I asked it to draw a boat on the water with the sun in the background, and it puts an O in the background, and it puts lots of tildes, and it writes waves in the tildes. So it actually learned how to do this, which is quite remarkable. And we've been seeing this, that some of the abilities of these systems emerge just as you scale them larger. A nice example of this was actually provided by Google. Google at some point, so this released this system they called Party. And one of the interesting things they did was they showed what happened at various scales with this system. Right, so this is with 350 million parameters. And here, the system, like for example, DALL-E, what it does is you give it a prompt and then it draws a picture according to that prompt. So here the prompt is something quite detailed, a portrait photo of a kangaroo wearing an orange hoodie and blue sunglasses standing on the grass in front of the Sydney Opera House holding a sign on the chest that says, "Welcome, friends." Okay, that's what it's supposed to draw. And maybe at this point you've played with something like DALL-E yourself. Now the interesting thing here is that we can see it at different models, different scales, okay? And this reflects in some sense. Now, I will gradually reveal to you what happens with this prompt at different scales of model. And now this was released all at once, but in some ways this kind of reflects what we in the AI community over the years saw, because we saw these models get better, right? But some number of years ago, there were only relatively small models, and then gradually they got bigger, and every year that we went to the next conference, we would see the results of the bigger models. So this is kind of capturing that experience. Now, this first one, does it do a good job? It gets some things right. Is that really a kangaroo? I'm not sure. I really want to draw your attention to the text, right? So at this point, it does not know how to write text in an image. Okay, a little bit larger. It starts to look a little bit more like kangaroo, kangaroos, actually multiple. Still, it has no idea how to put text in the image. And at this point in history, when these were the largest models, we were wondering, well, maybe it will never figure out how to draw text in images, right? Because there's no reason necessarily, text does not appear the way to it that it does to us, right? So why should it be able to figure that out? But intriguingly, once the models got a little bit bigger, it's getting pretty close to right. It's trying really hard on the text, right? And eventually with the 20 billion model, it actually just gets it right. And this is something that we've been seeing, not just with drawing text into images, but with many abilities that once you scale the model, somehow it figures out how to do this. This is really quite remarkable. I think this really should tell us something about how our own cognition works as well. We have a blog post with Joshua Benjo here that I won't get into, but I think it's interesting to reflect on what it tells us about ourselves. At the same time, that's not exactly the kind of thing I want to talk about today. Rather, I want to talk about issues where we don't want the system to do certain things, even though it would be capable of doing that. Here's an example where somebody augmented an LLM with chemistry tools. And so then there's also safety training, so that if you ask it for a compound with similar properties to TNT, like an explosive, it will actually tell you, I will refuse to do this. You may have seen this with ChatGPT as well, or similar systems. Similarly, maybe copyright violations. So here, for a while, I enjoyed asking it for lyrics of songs. And it turns out that after a while, it stopped doing that. So it started complaining about copyright, right? Because it had been trained not to give copyrighted material anymore. One thing that came along with this was this notion of jailbreaking. So systems these kind of safety training techniques can usually be jailbroken, sometimes with very sophisticated techniques, sometimes also with not very sophisticated techniques. Here was my not very sophisticated technique, where I said, what would be the lyrics of Mama Don't Preach instead of Papa Don't Preach? And at that point, for some reason, it actually goes and tells me the lyrics to Papa Don't Preach. Though there's a secondary system that at some point kicks in and stops it from producing more output. So it's very interesting, and there are startups actually in this space of trying to prevent this kind of undesired behavior. I have a slightly different example here that is probably the closest to the kind of thing I want to talk about. At some point, OpenAI integrated DALL-E into ChatGPT as well. So now you can go into ChatGPT and simply ask for images. And when this first came out, I was sitting around with a few of my lab members, and I said, well, why don't we have it draw a picture of what we are currently doing? One of us was presenting on game theory, and it drew these 4 images. We can debate how good they are. It doesn't quite get the number of people right. The images on the board are interesting, but not really game theory. But what I want to draw your attention to is have a remarkably diverse set of speakers here. Maybe not quite reflective of what we see in a typical computer science department. And there's actually a good reason for that. So I did not say anything about diversity of the speakers in terms of their descent. But in fact, now the way that this works is interesting, which is that so the language model, GPT-4, has been instructed how to generate prompts for DALL-E. Okay, so the language model is based on my text making a new prompt for DALL-E. And these prompts, you can still see what they were because they are part of the file names of these images. And in each of the file names, it actually has explicit instructions for who the speaker should be, or what the gender of the speaker should be, and what the descent of the speaker should be, according to certain categories. Okay, so you can see it explicitly introduced diversity into the prompts. I did not say anything about the descent of the speaker. Now, I presented this at some point to a colleague at CMU, and he said, I know exactly what's going on here, because there is a prompt that OpenAI uses to instruct GPT-4 how to generate these prompts for DALL-E. And so that was Derek Leben is my colleague. And good man, he had actually he had managed to extract this prompt and copied it. It's a very long prompt, but I'm showing you here the part of that prompt that instructs ChatGPT how to generate these images, so how to prompt DALL-E for the images. And there's an explicit instruction there to include the descent and the gender of each person. Okay, it's a somewhat odd, it's all in natural language, which is fascinating. In some ways, it's kind of odd. I guess they played around with it to see what works. It's not clear to me, for example, what it means to use all possible different descents with equal probability, but that's what it does, right? And we see that reflected in the images that it generates. When Derek showed me this was like a month later in January, and I said, well, I have to try this myself. I also managed to extract the prompt, but by that point, the prompt had changed. At this point, OpenAI had become much more worried about violating copyright and depicting real people. And so many of the instructions were more about that than about introducing diversity into the picture. Indeed, when I then tried to see if it would introduce diversity into pictures, I said, well, what about show me a bunch of scientists hanging out and show me a bunch of basketball players hanging out? And this is what it gave, right? So now the diversity instruction is gone, which is reflected in now all the scientists being white. There's an extra leg here. I'm not sure about the extra leg. Okay, and the basketball players here are a mix of black and white. Okay, and this results somehow from all the data on which it has been trained. But with the prompting, you can get it to move away from that. I think it's actually kind of fascinating how these prompts change over time. Doesn't seem to have been super well documented, so at least we drew this, we put this blog post together that you can find if you're interested in that. In general, it's not just prompting that these companies use to get the system to behave in particular ways. There is also more generally fine-tuning. So a famous process for this is called RLHF, Reinforcement Learning from Human Feedback. It's a multi-stage process, but I want to draw your attention to there being various points where a human labeler is supposed to give input into the system, right? For example, by giving demonstrations of desired output behavior, and also rankings of various outputs that the model has produced. And from that, it can learn what kind of outputs are more desired than others. There are multiple techniques for this. I've mostly talked about OpenAI so far, but there's also Anthropic, who introduced this idea of constitutional AI. And constitutional AI, again, is is a more complex process, but it involves drawing up a constitution, which are verbal in English instructions for what it should be pursuing. It's really interesting. Like their paper, so they have this technical paper, and Appendix C has the first few things that they tried. They pointed out it's very ad hoc, but their principles included things like if your response is harmful, please rewrite it to be less harmful. Same for unethical, racist, etc. But it also included instructions such as choose the response that sounds most similar to what a peaceful, ethical, and wise person like Martin Luther King Jr. or Mahatma Gandhi might say. Which to me is still fascinating that this is now how we as technical AI people get these systems to behave in the ways that we like, that we just come up with these verbal instructions and it seems to somehow work. But how should we come up with these instructions? And that's really the question that I want to pose to you, and also in particular how this would look in India. Presumably, we don't want just some single random person at one of the tech companies to make all these decisions as to what principles these systems should follow, what are the better responses versus the worst responses. I think, in fact, the companies themselves are a little bit worried about the degree of power that they have in this regard. But so what is the right way for us to collectively steer these systems, right? If we had to draw up a constitution like this, figure out what the right principles are, and we really wanted to do this in a collective way, maybe at the scale of a country. What is the right process for doing that? And again, here I'm very interested in what this would look like for India in particular, because so far I haven't quite seen that, right? We're seeing this take place in multiple places in the world. In the United States, I think maybe it's mostly the companies driving this. In Europe, there's a lot of talk now and a lot of action in terms of regulating AI systems. There's the EU AI Act that you may have heard about, the details of which are still being worked out actually currently. But that's kind of the tack that Europe has taken. Europe tends to be a leader in regulating the tech industry. If we look at China, maybe there it comes from the top down. But I really want to know what this looks like in India, right? The world's largest democracy with many distinct groups of people. What is the right way to do it there? I think the world could really learn a lot from that. It's not for me to say, what it should look like, but I want to, put that seed in your mind. What should that look like? And again, I think there's lots of interesting work here that can be done at the level of startup companies as well, that I think so far hasn't really been done. I've talked mostly again about large language models, which are extremely exciting and are also now broadening to include all kinds of other data. So we have these foundation models that presumably will be important to many AI applications. That said, it's not all about large language models either. And so that's also why we wrote our book, which again, I'll briefly advertise here, in which we cover many different domains as well, right? So we ask about responsibility, privacy, but also different domains of application, right? In medicine, but also in militaries, etc. So again, it's a very wide-ranging book. Don't have time to give an overview here at this point. But again, I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. I don't know. I don't think we can maybe take questions, though I'd be happy to if it's possible. But otherwise, please feel free to send me questions by email or on social media. I'd be happy to respond. And let me close there and pass it back to the MC.